family, the fourth oldest of 9 children. In young adulthood, Kant attended the University of Königsberg, where he soon became interested in the natural sciences, mathematics, and philosophy. As his exposure to the recent achievements of the scientific revolution and enlightenment increasingly revealed to him the emerging power of human reason and independent thinking, Kant became critical of his religious upbringing and religious and political authority in general. He observed the modern world shifting alongside him, away from blind faith in religious and political authority and into secular, independent, rational thinking. However, Kant, having seen and understood the value of religion in the lives of the people he had known, and having appreciated and respected how it promoted ethical behavior and good conduct, he worried about the consequences of humanity shifting away from it. Kant saw humanity at a juncture in which it was now mature enough to leave home, but not mature enough to know how to live well on its own. During and following his education, Kant published many works dealing with topics related to metaphysics, ethics, epistemology, politics, and aesthetics, focusing his life's work on helping facilitate the Western world's successful transition into a new enlightened age. In his masterwork, Critique of Pure Reason, as well as throughout several of his other works, Kant attempted to do this by examining current conceptions of knowledge and reality, synthesizing new models of understanding, and defining reason as the ultimate source of good. Kant wrote, "Our age is the age of criticism, to which everything must be subjected. The sacredness of religion and the authority of legislation are by many regarded as grounds of exemption from the examination of this tribunal. But if they are exempted, they become the subjects of just suspicion, and cannot lay claim to sincere respect, which reason accords only to that which has stood the test of a free and public examination." Ultimately, Kant's work attempted to provide a framework for understanding how we come to understand the world and how and why we ought to behave in a certain way in relation to it. Put differently, he sought to answer how we take in the chaos of the natural world, distill it within us into order, into meaning, and into ethical behavior. Kant was not trying to destroy what religion had historically provided, but rather, he sought to augment and replenish it for the conditions of the modern age. In Critique of Pure Reason, Kant discusses the process through which he believes we come to acquire knowledge. At the time, there were 2 primary schools of thought, empiricism and rationalism. Empiricists argued that all knowledge is derived from our sense experiences. Rationalists argued that knowledge is chiefly arrived at through reason. Kant, however, found himself somewhere in between the two, believing that knowledge is derived from a particular combination of our sense experiences and our faculty for reason, all facilitated by a framework of a priori conditions. He famously wrote, "Thoughts without content are empty. Intuitions without concepts are blind." In other words, we need input data to process, but we also need a priori conditions to process that data in order to output any meaning. When referring to a priori conditions here, this simply means something that is acquired independently of experience. In relation to the mind and knowledge, Kant defined these as space, time, reason, and self-consciousness. We need space and time to discern features of external experiences. We need reason to process experiences into representations or ideas. And we need consistent self-consciousness or identity in order to unify the process from a fixed position. These all must exist first before experience or observation for there to be any experiences or observations at all. Kant writes, "Self-consciousness does not yet come about by my accompanying each representation with consciousness, but rather by my adding one representation to the other and being conscious of their synthesis. Therefore, it is only because I can combine a manifold of given representations in one consciousness that it is possible for me to represent the identity of the consciousness in these representations." Ultimately, Kant arrives at a sort of synthesis of empiricism and rationalism, in which a certain limited kind of knowledge about the world can be attained uniquely through human reason. Kant wrote, "All our knowledge begins with the senses, proceeds then to the understanding, and ends with reason. There is nothing higher than reason." As a result of this, Kant believed that knowledge about how we ought to act in the world also comes from reason. To be moral as a rational being, for Kant, is to act rationally. Kant centers his entire ethical theory on perhaps one of his most famous philosophical concepts, the categorical imperative. In its original formulation, Kant describes it with the following: "Act only according to that maxim whereby you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law." In other words, if you would not will everyone else to do the same thing you're doing, it is an unethical act. We can determine this by asking ourselves, if the whole world committed the act, would the world no longer function, or at the very least be worse for you? If yes, to act in such a way, you are contradicting and harming yourself. For example, if everyone committed theft, you would become a victim of theft, and the world would become dysfunctional. Thus, no rational person could see it right to steal, and to act otherwise breaks moral law, like breaking the laws of mathematics. All of this, of course, is a sort of formal reconstruction of the Golden Rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Kant attempts to take this further, however, by grounding it in a secular philosophical system that showcases, essentially, that being immoral does not make rational sense, and that determinations of what is moral can be concluded from reason alone. Of course, all this leads to some potential problems. What happens when the apparently more rational thing to do goes against categorical imperatives? What happens when someone can cause more harm or allow more harm by strictly abiding by rigid moral principles? What if, for example, you stole a weapon from someone to prevent them from harming a group of people whom they were about to attack with it? Is this immoral simply because you broke the moral principle of not stealing? Is it not more rational, though, to steal the weapon than to commit rigidly to the moral principle of never stealing? People who might follow the ethical theory known as utilitarianism would argue that it is more rational and moral to steal the weapon, making moral laws flexible to situations. Moreover, in a much broader sense, what are moral determinations objectively even based on, using reason? Human prosperity? But is not human prosperity subjective? How can we base an objective ethical system in something that is entirely dependent on human subjectivity? Are we even truly rational beings? How can we ground our process of thinking in something outside our process of thinking? For what reason do we have other than reason itself to follow reason? Reason seems like the highest order of cognition, of understanding, but does that sufficiently ground it in anything objective, in anything fixed or rigid? Reason itself seems to be only defensible through circular reasoning. Ultimately, although Kant got some things wrong and left some things unresolved, he got some crucial things right, and perhaps more importantly, he helped reveal new problems in need of resolving and getting right. He directly inspired subsequent revolutionary thinkers like Hegel, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Freud, Wittgenstein, and so many more, influencing virtually all of Western thinking in general, still to this day. He helped lead and contribute to mankind's courageous, still occurring step out from the shelter of its youth and into the world, as thinking things in desperate search for a new, better, independent condition of life, a new chapter, a new place to call home. Wherever it comes from, whatever it is, we have seemingly all been given something that compels us to understand, to organize, to live well, and to find reasons to treat others with kindness so as to allow them to do the same. Throughout history, we have tried so many times in so many ways, whether through the nurturing of kinship in primitive times, through religions, through reason, through science. Through it all, we have yet to fully understand where morality comes from, if it is objective or real outside of us, and how to define and explain it if it is. But yet, in every age and every day, though messy and deeply flawed, somehow the world continues to function. And every day, the vast majority of us attempt to treat those we encounter, those we know, those we love, with kindness. And perhaps that's real enough. In the words of Kant, two things fill my mind with ever-increasing wonder and awe, the more often and the more intensely the reflection dwells on them: the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me.
This video was sponsored by Blinkist. Garrett wants to explore philosophy and science more in his free time. He's always enjoyed these subjects, but general education never really made it enjoyable or accessible to him. Now, in early adulthood, he's begun trying on his own, picking out and reading all sorts of books, both classics and modern. The problem is, Garrett continually finds himself reading material that he struggles with understanding, or ends up not even really being that interested
Latest. Where is it? Death. "101 deep dives."
Of a problem is one of the
The 8. I don't. Because it's the easy choose to feel miserable. Why? No goals. Everything's just too difficult. It's too late for trust. Having accountability for myself. Now feeling particularly responsible for myself. Why is it that I need to understand the word? Wow, this is so pretty. This looks so pretty. I wonder how it looks in real life. Of course, I'm never gonna push myself to pursue this in real life. Where does that hate come from? Laziness. Self-deprecation. It's because I'm isolated. And I already established that I should be friends with myself, and I'm not treating myself as such. Imagine if you could watch this in real life. Would you become so inspired as to want to change for the better? Or would you act completely the same once you come back after a month or two, like it's always been? Okay, I have nothing else important to say, so
Suppose there is a couple, the Joneses, who just gave birth to a baby boy named Sammy. As they stand together in the hospital gazing down at their newborn, they share an awareness that the life ahead of Sammy will be filled with an indeterminable amount of both pleasure and suffering, happiness and heartbreak, miracle and tragedy. then in an instant, the harsh reality of their baby's future hits them, and for a fleeting second, they look into each other's eyes and think,
So pretty.
if we hadn't given birth to him in the first place, he wouldn't suffer anything. Right there, they both make the decision to give Sammy the best life they can, and to prevent him from experiencing as much suffering as is humanly possible. The Joneses are great parents for thinking this, but in the words of David Benatar, it is curious that while good people go to great lengths to spare their children from suffering, few of them seem to notice that the one and only guaranteed way to prevent all the suffering of their children is to not bring those children into existence in the first place.
Right.
This is the philosophy of antinatalism. It's the thought that human procreation is unethical, the belief that any action with suffering as its byproduct should not be encouraged, no matter how much pleasure will follow as well. Although the roots of antinatalism can be traced all the way back to ancient Greece, the philosophy has experienced a particular spike in popularity over the last decade or so. This recent resurgence can be accredited, by and large, to the South African philosopher David Benatar, who authored what may be the most widely known literature on the subject. In his book Better Never to Have Been, Benatar argues that his antinatalist views come from a place of compassion, stating that the only way to truly prevent the suffering that comes with existence is to not exist in the first place. And he isn't the first person to have this thought. The Greek tragedian Sophocles once said, "Never to have been born is best." Heinrich Heine, the 19th century German poet, wrote, "Sleep is good, death is better, but of course, the best thing would have been to never have been born at all." And the preacher in Ecclesiastes said, "So I have praised the dead that are already dead more than the living that are yet alive. But better than both of them is he who has not yet been, who has not seen the evil work that is done under the sun." So as you can see, the school of thought that non-existence is inherently better than existence isn't a new one. In recent years, though, these ideas have given rise to the antinatalist belief that seeks to end human procreation. There are two different schools of thought under the antinatalistic argument. The first is the one David Benatar makes when he says we should spare the unborn from suffering that is life. This argument centers around the harm in which existence poses on the baby being born. On the other hand of the spectrum, the misanthropic arguments for antinatalism that center more around the harm that babies being born will go on to inflict upon one another, other animals, and the environment as a whole. To put it into context, consider this. The average carbon footprint for a single person in the United States has been estimated to be around 16 to 20 tons per year, meaning that just fulfilling daily necessities such as driving, showering, eating, and using electricity has unimaginably damaging consequences towards the environment we live in. So to antinatalists, the most ethical way to solve this problem is to prevent it from happening in the first place. Both antinatalist arguments, whether philanthropic or misanthropic, are centered around one core problem, suffering, and one proposed solution, to stop giving birth. And you might say, well, what about all the good things in life? Why would you not want a child to experience all of that? Well, antinatalists believe that in human life, there is an inherent imbalance, or asymmetry, between pleasure and suffering. Let's take Sammy, for instance. Because Sammy has been born, he would experience pain, which is bad, and pleasure, which is good. However, if Sammy was never born, then he would never experience pain, which is good, and he also wouldn't experience pleasure, which is not bad. The argument therefore is that the presence of pain will always be objectively more harmful than the absence of pleasure, and so it makes sense to preserve the absence of pleasure rather than introduce the presence of pain. Everyone suffers from being human, but no one suffers from not existing in the first place. A second argument that the followers of antinatalists bring forward is the hypothetical consent argument, which states that no one can consent to being born. Consent is simply defined as the act of giving permission for something to happen, and according to the antinatalist hypothetical consent argument, the unborn cannot give permission to being brought into the world, and so, as a result, the act of procreation should be seen as non-consensual, and therefore unethical. If we're focusing solely on the information we have about pre-birth that is scientifically provable, then the hypothetical consent argument is pretty difficult to argue against. But of course, as we know, the full extent of our pre-birth experience isn't yet known by scientists, or even anyone for that matter.
I am a psychologist, and I know that there are depths of the mind that have remained untapped for most of us in our normal business of going about our affairs.
This uncertainty opens up the door for a wide array of pseudoscientists who seek to explore the nature of our pre-birth experience using methods which, although can't be definitely proven by science, still add some thought-provoking counterclaims that are worth considering. One of those pseudoscientists is Helen Wambach, who hypnotized 750 subjects in the 1970s and asked them the question, "Did you choose to be born?" The responses she aggregated were quite staggering. 81% of Wambach's subjects reported that they did choose to be born, while 19% reported that they were either unaware of the choice or they got no clear answer to that question. Of course, again, research and findings gathered from hypnosis can't be scientifically proven. But in the face of the seemingly unknowable, studies like this pose at least some perspective that should not be disregarded entirely. However, focusing back on the data that we do have definitive answers to, consider the story of Gold Mana, written by Sienna Schifrin, which is used by antinatalists as an example for the hypothetical consent argument. Gold Mana is a wealthy man who lives on an island and decides one day, for reasons unknown, that he wants to donate some of his wealth to his neighbors on an adjacent island. These neighbors are comfortably off, but would still objectively benefit from his donation. Unfortunately though, due to historical tension between the governments of these neighboring islands, Gold Mana and his agents aren't able to physically go to the adjacent island, nor are they permitted by law to even communicate with the people living there. But still determined to donate, he handcrafts several heavy cubes of gold, each worth $5 million. Then he flies his plane over the neighboring island and drops the cubes down to the civilians underneath. He tries to avoid hitting people with the cubes, knowing that it could cause injury, but eventually after gifting several people with the wealth, he hits one person, who the story aptly names Unlucky. The impact of the cube breaks Unlucky's arm, yet at the same time grants them $5 million. Schifrin acknowledges that, on the one hand, with all the elements of the story considered, Unlucky was an overall beneficiary of Gold Mana's actions, as the $5 million that they received is enough to cover the cost of the broken arm and then some. Yet on the other hand, Schifrin argues that an objective wrong was still committed by Gold Mana, since the harm he inflicted on the Unlucky wasn't consensual, despite how much the payout might have outweighed the harm. Unlucky was living a decent life before Gold Mana came into the picture. His life wasn't pleasurable, but he didn't suffer any pain either. After the cube dropped on his arm, he experienced both pain and pleasure. In light of all this, we have to ask the question, which then is better? To have experienced pain and pleasure, or not any at all? I think to answer that, we have to define what pain, or in this case, suffering, is. For millennia, philosophers have traveled to great depths to dissect what this experience really means, and why it corresponds so closely with human life. One of those philosophers was Fyodor Dostoevsky, the infamous Russian novelist whose work contemplates the spiritual dimensions of human psychology in extraordinary depth, and who invented the genre of existentialist literature. Dostoevsky's final book, The Brothers Karamazov, tells the story of three brothers, Dmitri, Ivan, and Alyosha, whose opposing spiritual and world views are forced into question when they are tasked with solving their father's murder. The novel's most theatrical ideological clash occurs between Ivan, the middle son who is broken away from his religious family in pursuit of a more Western and rationalist education, and Alyosha, his spirited younger brother who has chosen to remain attached to his family's faith. Ivan claims that due to the existence of suffering, and more specifically the suffering of innocent children, to believe in the omniscience of God and the goodness of people is illogical, impossible, and impermissible. He laments, "Listen, if everyone must suffer in order to buy eternal harmony, pray tell me what children have got to do with it. It's quite incomprehensible why they should have to suffer." Through the character of Ivan, Dostoevsky paints a clear picture of a man whose compassionate intellectualism supersedes his faith in humanity so far to the point where he rejects the idea of human life altogether. Sound familiar? Several parallels can be drawn between Dostoevsky's Ivan and Benatar's antinatalism, as both believe that if suffering is so synonymous with human life, then non-existence is the better alternative. This argument Ivan poses is more broadly referred to as the problem of evil, and it is one of the most ancient and compelling defenses against the belief of God that exists in philosophical literature to date. The argument's possible origins have been traced back to Epicurus, an ancient Greek sage, who famously asked, "Is God willing to prevent evil, but not able? Then he isn't omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then from whence comes evil?" The last question, whence comes evil, or in other words, where does evil come from, is yet another heavily debated subject which is, of course, ultimately unanswerable. However, antinatalists would likely argue that whatever origin or meaning suffering may carry matters little, as it is irrelevant in the face of suffering's devastation. And in a sense, I completely agree, as searching for meaning to assign to suffering can so easily become a slippery slope which will lead people to excuse, disregard, or gloss over the objective reality of both their own suffering and the suffering of others. Yet, at the same time, the practice of assigning meaning to suffering can also be a powerful coping mechanism, which can transform the internal world of a person who is tasked to live with its heavy burdens. The answer, like most things, possibly lies somewhere in the middle of these two extremes, and differs from person to person. In a way, both antinatalist philosophies and the ideas of Dostoevsky's Ivan challenge us to come to terms with the reality of human suffering. Every day we're faced with things in our existence that are so factually unanswerable to the point that they can only be addressed through the lens of hypotheticals or faith. However, suffering, unlike these elusive, unanswerable existential questions, is very much real, tangible, devastating, overwhelming, and ever-present. You turn on the TV and hear one bad news story after the other. You go online and you're reading stories of corruption, human rights violations, and wars all around the globe. With humanity's suffering even more prominent now that we have access to world news at our fingertips, it's no wonder then that arguments for antinatalism are becoming more and more compelling and seeing a rise culturally. In the end, we're faced with one question. In the face of all that we know to be concretely true about the reality of suffering, should you choose to believe that human life isn't worth creating, or that it would have been better if you hadn't been born? Or do you choose to still have faith in that intangible sliver of hope that there is some larger reason for your coming to this earth in the first place, despite the suffering that your existence entails? No matter which side of the fence you stand on, I think it's important to acknowledge questions of this nature, questions of faith. It's because our attitudes towards and surrounding all that is unanswerable about our existence ultimately forms the philosophical bedrock of how we view the world and how we'll go on to act in our lives. Although Alyosha, Ivan's faithful younger brother, doesn't pose a very compelling counter-argument to Ivan's laments during their famous fight that I mentioned earlier, the subsequent actions he takes throughout the rest of the novel go on to demonstrate Dostoevsky's final illustration of how one should conduct themselves even in the face of suffering and in relation to the problem of evil. Alyosha's direction has him working on the ground, directly with the impoverished school children of his community, doing the tedious work of actually making their day-to-day lives more enjoyable and infusing their lives with a sense of meaning. Alyosha becomes an active participant, helping out in every instance of suffering he encounters. This is made particularly clear through his mentorship of a young impoverished boy, whose suicide Alyosha prevents with his compassion. Meanwhile, Ivan spends the second half of the story dissolving into a state of delirium after realizing that his intellectual arguments against human life led to the murder of his own father, as they gave another man the confidence to abandon his faith and carry out an act of evil in the world. Dostoevsky's final message was that ultimately, the actions we take in the face of suffering matter more than the intellectual beliefs we hold and preach to others about the nature of suffering. To me, whether or not one chooses to believe that human procreation is ethical matters less than the quality of the subsequent actions which that belief system guides them to take in the world. Like the Joneses, would you be aware of the harsh reality of human suffering and prepare yourself to do everything in your power to protect the ones you love from it? Or will you simply throw your hands in the air and say, I didn't choose to be here anyways, so I don't care what happens?
Right.
In the end, one should only feel confident holding beliefs against procreation after they can assess whether or not these beliefs can serve them with an effective means of coping with, and helping others to cope with, the suffering directly within and around them. Because, again, whether we realize it or not, our beliefs about the nature of existence hold great power over who we are, and how we act in the world. As Dostoevsky's final novel boldly states, is the only meaningful resource we have to combat the reality of suffering that comes with our existence.
Consciousness. It's our awareness, our understanding,
our ignorance. Our daily consciousness leaves out more than it takes in. And due to this, it leaves out important things. Things that would help relieve us if we knew them. If we had a higher awareness, a better consciousness, we would feel better. We would be more at peace with things. The deep down truth of things is screened by our consciousness. Our sensory organs will pick things out. Our eyes can only see certain things, our ears can only hear certain things. We have to create instruments and other tools to see things we as humans cannot, to expand our understanding and thus our ego, or consciousness. Humans evolved and became the dominant species on Earth by a long shot. It's due to our innate ability to network with each other. If humanity was wiped out and restarted, like loading an old save file, communities would still form. Structures within society are inevitable due to the variety of brains. Some are good at critical thinking, others are more artistic. However, we are all wired with some innate features. Just as humans form societies that evolve, other creatures do as well. But we're different. We are customizable characters, basically. We can kind of mold ourselves into whatever kind of person we want to be. We can't know for certain that animals or any other life on Earth is conscious or can even function in the same way that we do. Let's put it this way. I know that I have my own thoughts and feelings and emotions, but how can I know for certain that you, or anyone else, does? There's no way I can go to your head and see things 100% from your perspective. I can't know what you're thinking, or if you can even think in the first place. To truly understand the universe, to understand and actually experience life, you have to give yourself up. There's no point in sustaining bliss, in being permanently at an all-time high. The life you're living is what you have put yourself into. What ego you've formed, only you don't want to admit it. You want to believe it happened to you. Day to day, you play non-bliss in order to be able to experience bliss. You put yourself into bad situations. You let in the negative experiences in life just to feel some kind of satisfaction when it goes the other way. Self implies other. White implies black. Death implies life. You can feel your existence as fundamental, not as an accident. At the basic level, at the lowest level imaginable, you are the fundamentals of existence. The same thing that makes you is the same thing that makes up everything else. If you can step back from what you believe, if you can step back from what your sensory organs have turned you into, you start to see things for what they actually are. Do you define yourself as a victim of the world, or as the world? Love is only possible due to the lack of self. You give up all your secrets, the walls you've built to keep people at an arm's distance slowly lower, one by one, until you're a completely open book, until all your pages have been read, and the rest of the pages are blank, waiting to be filled with this newfound love. In basketball, or soccer, or football, you're constantly giving the ball to someone else. The point of the game is to have the ball in your hand for the least amount of time, to constantly be passing it to someone else, to shoot it, to get it out of your hands. It keeps the game going, and life is the same way. If you define yourself, you, as only being what your ego is, as the things you do voluntarily, then you're the victim. It's because of some higher power that you were put here when you didn't ask for it. But what about the things you do involuntarily? Do you beat your heart, or does it just happen to you? You do those things, even though you don't know how. Words don't work here. As Alan Watts said, everyone is fundamentally the alternate reality. Not God in a traditional sense, but God in the sense of being the self, the deep down basic whatever there is. And you're all that. only you're pretending you're not. A mind that can ask, who am I? Why am I here? What is the purpose of all of this? Tends to forget. As I said, your consciousness tends to leave out critical information at times. A consciousness that can view the world and take in sensory information tends to forget what's behind those eyes. A mind that hasn't gone deep enough to find where those questions come from. Because the same place those questions come from is the same place those answers lie. The brain controls everything. In order to go to the extremes of the universe, to places we can only dream of going, we must first dive deep into something that is all inside of us. Take the Big Bang, for example. Now there's hundreds, thousands of theories as to how we came into existence, but let's go with this one. You believe that you are strictly you. Your human body is all that you are and all that you have ever been. You're simply a small speck of dust in a vast sea of galaxies, stars, planets. You're irrelevant. But rolling back the clock, things get smaller. The universe was more compact. The atoms that make you up are building blocks of the universe, of the hot gas clouds that form stars, that allowed solar systems to form, that allowed planets like Earth to form. If you keep rolling back this clock, you were around at the very instant everything came into existence. That is you too. When everything was infinitesimally small, you were there. But we define ourselves as being only us, mere humans walking on a planet that we didn't ask to get put on. But frankly, every one of us somehow made this happen. We just go on and pretend we didn't. It's because of how we define ourselves. Are you the victim, or are you the world? As cringy as it may sound, everyone you meet is just a small packet of the universe. A present, whether they're a pleasant one or not, that was packaged together from billions of years of engineering and architecture on a universal scale. But instead, we define ourselves as something completely separate from it, something not connected whatsoever, which is a foolish view. We tend to search for how the universe came into being, but we're just the universe trying to understand itself. In order to get to that conclusion, we have to reframe our mindset. We're not as different as we all think. Your name is given to you at birth. Your ideas and personality are collected from the world. Scraps, bits and pieces here and there cling to you like a magnet. So what part of you is you? We are all different manifestations of consciousness, but we are all fundamentally the same thing. We all may have different egos, different personalities, but when you step back, drop the ego, we are all connected. View the universe as a forest. Every one of us is a twig, a leaf, a branch. But together, we form life. Our origin, our roots, are connected together. Just as the roots of trees form a vast network which brings these massive forests to life, humanity's roots all come from the same place. Energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be transferred from one form of energy to another. But many of us have this fear that it's all going to come to an end. And while yes, your life will end, your energy will not. It will continue onward, forever. But our consciousness has convinced us otherwise. We form this thought process, almost like we've been hypnotized, to think that we are all there is and all there ever will be, and that it's all going to come to an end. This leaves us unsatisfied and unhappy. But the universe is continuous, and you are technically the universe, so you will continue on as well. Your death is not the end of you, it's the death of your ego. Many people experience the same exact thing while living. Ego death. It tends to be induced through psychedelic drugs, LSD, shrooms, the list goes on. While working on this video, I actually experienced it myself, and although not intentional, it provided clarity in a way I've never before experienced. It's not the ego in the vernacular sense, as describing a person's self-worth. It's the philosophical ego. It's the complete loss of subjective self-identity. Everything that you believe you are will disappear. You're void of emotion, of connection to anything around you, of connection to what makes you, you. The idea of being a person doesn't make any sense. The words I, me, and myself have zero meaning whatsoever. The world can normally be put into two categories, myself and not myself. While experiencing ego death, this line is blurred. I am completely gone. There's only the awareness of existence. The lifetime accumulation of your thoughts and emotions are put on pause. It's as if you're on a cliff approaching an infinite void beneath you. Your life is continuous and exists all the way up the mountain until you reach the edge. Beneath you, though, is the unknown. Ego death is jumping into that void, leaving behind everything you've ever known. It's as if you've stepped out of your body into a separate entity. You start to see things for what they actually are, but things don't actually exist. Things is just a noun, it's a fragment of speech, and speech is just another instrument we've created to try and understand the world around us. Our senses allow us to go about our daily lives and traverse the world, but they don't really offer any explanations, so we have to make them up ourselves. While experiencing ego death, you disconnect from all of that. You have a heightened awareness. It's truly as if you're experiencing a higher level of consciousness that no person can understand. You reach this level that words can't explain. The instruments we made to try and understand our place in the universe shatter completely. Explaining it in terms of I saw or I felt don't seem reasonable. Our languages are instruments created to explain things that someone experiences. But while undergoing ego death, there is no someone. There is no me. So how do you describe it? It's as if your slate was wiped clean, your character's save file was corrupted, but you're still in the game. Because of this, ego death can be scary, but it can also be a very enlightening experience. It's both constricting and freeing. It's white and black. It's like you're defining what life is like through experiencing death. We cannot be more sensitive and welcoming to pleasure without being more sensitive and accepting to pain. You're flying and sinking at the same time, being pulled from below, and above, in every direction, at once. While going through it, I ended up reaching a moment of acceptance. Ego death, while often extremely anxiety-inducing, offers a glimpse into a reality free of that. A life free of your personal flaws, your daily thoughts, your responsibilities. It personally feels as if time is frozen, and wherever your mind wanders is free to judge things as they truly are. You are the observer and the observable. Surprisingly, the conclusion I came to is the same conclusion I came to while making a previous video of mine, and it's that nothing in life really matters. Fear in general tends to come from us not being able to make peace with the chaos that is the universe, not being able to cope with the idea of entropy, that everything is tending towards disorder. Forming an ego is disorderly in the same way. You go further and further down your own tunnel and stray further from everyone else. Experiencing ego death is breaking out of that tunnel, pulling back, and understanding that the network of these tunnels that encompass every human on Earth all eventually return back to the same place. When I die, when my ego is completely gone forever, when my physical body breaks down and no longer resembles the form it's in today, I'll still somehow be here. Right now, I'm an hourglass. The sand is slowly leaking its way to the bottom, and eventually it'll all be there. It's the end of the line for me. But when that day comes, the universe will stop by, take the hourglass, flip it over, and whatever made me me will then become something entirely different. We're all just a temporary collection of atoms, and whatever you and I subjectively believe we are won't last forever. But objectively, we will. For now, just enjoy the ride.
While your consciousness is still in this plane of existence, there's really only one thing you need to learn if you want to be successful and have a good life. Whether you're at school, work, or just interacting with friends and family, we're all subconsciously playing a game. The game of life. By understanding this game and how to win at it, you can become successful and really enjoy your time on this earth.
Are you the type of person to analyze every second of the interaction you just had with someone for hours on end, or are you normal? Either way, you probably don't think all that hard about every single detail of the decisions you make in social situations. But believe it or not,
What's normal? So, I have issue with nothing matters. And while I agree, like what's the point of this shifting left to right, turning off the computer, turning off this shit, going right to bed, eating, reaching out to my ex, telling her how I feel. person that is far smarter than me, who I can speak with and ask and bounce off ideas. But I've never really made the fucking effort to find that person to do it. I'd like to study more universe, psychology, and neuroscience. But I'm here playing a video game. And Friday, after 3 months of not working, I'm hating my much. I'm lazy. Feeling miserable. Because of how bad, how unlucky I've been. Why is that? Why am I? What's the fucking message? Is that the right question? What am I supposed to do? What's supposed to be the message? I'm still identifying a lot. Maybe true. Supposedly my thoughts, they just let my thoughts run wild. They're influenced by everything else around me. There's no such thing as free. So what is the fucking purpose of all this? Who am I talking to? Who's listening? Who is watching? I'm my best friend ever studying. And I just have this addiction of feeling bad about myself. This ego that's convincing me that I am the best at feeling the worst, at self-sabotaging, at doing the opposite because I know why. Because it's my eternal thirst to be different. But I am already different. Everyone is. is too difficult for me. I'm not enough. I'm not smart. I'm not strong. I don't have anything else to fight for. And I'm gonna be the best at just giving up. The best are just not human. Just another short from other people doing this. Then I'm just another one. So they say I gotta watch out for my thoughts. What is the universe trying to watch? Okay.
There's an entire scientific field that applies to social situations and decision making. We're talking about game theory. Game theory can be used to analyze both economic and social situations. It's essentially the science of strategy, and just like the reality it is trying to model, game theory can get really complicated. And yes, although game theory is relevant to games as we typically understand them, such as poker, most research in game theory focuses on how groups of people interact. Let's first define what a game is. So, what exactly is a game? It sounds like a stupid question, like who doesn't know what a game is? But games, in the field of game theory, are a slightly different concept to what you might expect. When it comes to game theoretic analysis, a game constitutes any interaction between multiple people where each person's payoff is affected by the decision made by others. Let's apply this definition of a game to a couple of games. Is Sudoku a game? Well, in the traditional sense, sure. But in game theory, no. Sudoku is not a game. Sudoku is not a game because how you decide to complete the puzzle doesn't affect any other player. There is, after all, only one player in the game. You. What about tic-tac-toe? Is that a game? Two players can play the game, and each box that is filled by one of the players affects the other player. Winning requires both players to respond optimally to what the other player is doing. So yes, it is a game. You could also have a situation where two shop owners choose from a finite number of positions where to strategically place their shops for maximum profit. They are each affected by what the other person does, since they may be opting for the same market, and there is certainly a win-lose situation here. So, even though placing your shop may not sound like much of a game, in the eyes of game theorists, it certainly is. Game theory is the study of games like these, and game theorists try to model games in a way that makes them easy to understand and analyze. I say easy, but a lot of games can end up having pretty similar properties or reoccurring patterns, and more often than not, things can get pretty complicated. Game theory has two main focuses: cooperative games and non-cooperative games. Most game theory models involve 5 conditions. It goes something like this. First, each player has 2 or more choices or sequence of choices. Think of these like typical moves in a game, like moving a chess piece. Second, all possible combinations of decisions or plays result in a clear outcome. Basically, you can win or lose. Third, it's clear how you can win or lose, and participants will gain or lose something depending on the outcome. Fourth, the players know the rules of the game as well as the payoffs of other players, meaning everyone is aware of what is desirable to the other players as well. And fifth, the players are rational and sensible people. Rational here means strictly that when they're faced with 2 alternatives, they'll choose the option that provides the greatest benefits. While players know the rules and their opponent's options, they don't know their opponent's actual decisions in advance. So players must choose options based on assumptions of what their opponents might choose. Some game theory scenarios are zero-sum games, meaning one player's win is another's loss, and vice versa. Others, however, allow mutual gains and losses. These games can involve multiple strategies. You can try to minimize the maximum losses another player can cause and make decisions based on probable outcomes. This all really just sounds a bit confusing, so here, just let me show you. If life is indeed a game, then the first rule is to be skeptical of other people's suggestions. As we said, if it's a game, someone else is going to be competing, so there's definitely going to be competition and sabotage. Perhaps a straightforward and well-known example is the prisoner's dilemma. The game goes like this. 2 criminals are caught red-handed and are arrested. Each has 2 choices. They can each either stay quiet or testify against their friend. Upon arrest, they are each separated and offered a deal. Testify against your friend and we'll let you off the hook easy with 1 year in prison and give the other person 10 years. If both stay quiet, the cops can't really prove the more serious charges and both criminals would spend only 2 years behind bars. If they both testify against each other, however, then both would get 5-year prison sentences. At first glance, keeping quiet seems like the best strategy. If they both did this, they would both be out after just 2 years. But right before they're about to testify, one of the two thinks to himself, what if I stay quiet and the other guy rats me out? Without knowing what the other person is actually going to decide, it's a reasonable worry to have. The smartest solution to this would be to react in a way that is beneficial regardless of what the other person does. A Nash equilibrium is actually a state in which no one person can improve, given what the others are doing. This means you're picking the best response to a particular strategy from your opponent. A quick analysis of the prisoner's dilemma reveals they would both most likely testify, which is the Nash equilibrium for this problem. This is because regardless of what the other person does, testifying will lead to a maximum sentence of 5 years, with the potential for a 1-year sentence. Meanwhile, if you don't testify, you could end up with a 10-year term. It's easily the safest thing to do considering neither party knows what the other is going to do, even though both criminals are better off if they just stayed quiet. Here, the individual incentive wins over group interest. Testifying is a better option, because you know that you'll be in trouble if you stay quiet but your friend testifies. But if you can think of that, your friend can too. So he knows you're likely going to testify given that it's the safer option for you, and you know he's likely going to testify too for the same reason, and you know that he knows that you're likely going to testify. You see the loop that's forming? These types of problems are examples of non-cooperative games, which means the 2 prisoners can't convey their intentions to each other. If they were able to talk to each other, however, we would be in a cooperative setting, and that would affect the likelihood of certain outcomes as you can imagine. For example, it'd become much easier for them to agree beforehand that they're both just going to stay quiet. On the contrary, a coordination game is one in which everyone benefits from working together. There's no incentive for either party to cheat, since it will result in a worse outcome than if they just cooperated. A good example is driving on the correct side of the road. You win nothing by driving on the wrong side of the road. But sometimes, you lose without even playing. The principal agent problem is when one person is allowed to make decisions on behalf of another person. In this situation, the first person is likely to prioritize their own interests and pursue their own goals. And well, yeah, that's the basis of modern politics. Game theory can also be applied to biology though. In fact, its application in the field of biology has allowed biologists to answer a lot of questions about evolution, which is remarkable since game theory was never designed for this. For example, it's helped scientists explain biological altruism, where an organism acts in a way that is most favorable for the overall species, even if that action is harmful to itself. A bird might warn the rest of the group about the arrival of a predator. Doing so risks its own life since it essentially announces itself to the predator. But this trait can later help that bird, assuming it survives of course, when other birds return the favor and warn it. These concepts might help you anticipate some of the strategies others might be using to get one over on you. But who really knows what they're thinking? The concept of guessing others' moves is what makes the game so tricky. While each player is likely to be certain about only their own move, they still have to speculate about other players' decisions, and more importantly, other players' conception of every other player's decision. Essentially, you are no longer making a decision based on what you think is right. Rather, you're anticipating what your opponent thinks is right, and simply reacting to it. But then again, your opponent is doing the same exact thing. So who's really making the decision here? Whose mind is the actual decision being made in? Let's put it another way. Each player must know their own chance of coming out on top, guess everyone else's chance, and also guess what everyone else is guessing about their own chances of winning. Not only this, but you also really need to be able to guess what other players are guessing about your guesses about them. And now look, we're confused again. Another problem is that, although game theory has many benefits, it would be impossible to properly apply it in all situations. There will be times where rationality might not offer the right solutions, or where mutual benefit might not be the most ideal outcome. When you come up against these, you have to not only recognize them, but then also decide whether using game theory would be the most helpful way to deal with the situation. By then, the moment could already be gone. The assumption that everyone is going to be rational, a basic premise of game theory, is also a really risky one. Humans can be extremely unpredictable and emotional,
and this makes the guessing work near impossible. There's a ton of real-life examples that illustrate the basic concepts of game theory. Apple and Samsung are involved in an endless game of advertising. It's not like either company needs to advertise. Besides, advertising can get extremely expensive. So why not just forego this task altogether and use the money for research and development? If both companies did this, then we'd probably have better phones by now. But sure enough, Apple banks on the possibility of Samsung advertising and gaining an edge over the market, and Samsung does the same. And that possibility soon turns into a certainty you and I have all come to accept. Now, this is an extremely simplistic example that bypasses many other variables, but you see the basic concept. Another good everyday example can be found in the treatment of public goods and property. If everyone decides to be good citizens and not litter, society benefits as a whole. But you're inevitably going to come up against one or more people who choose to essentially go rogue and behave selfishly by littering. This leads to society as a whole bearing the cost of cleaning up, all the while making not littering a less worthwhile decision. After all, if the road's already littered, the work to not litter is that much less meaningful. You can probably now see how applicable this is to other situations in life, like every big important decision we're supposed to be fixing, but more on that later. As interesting as it is, game theory can still only analyze simple situations with well-defined constraints, and you must remember that any model is a subset of reality, no matter how good it is. It's essentially intellectual guesswork. The bottom line? We're all constantly in the game. It's pretty impossible not to be. Our lives are endlessly and unavoidably impacted by the actions and decisions made by others, so you might as well play the game the best you can. And that interaction you spent hours analyzing after the other person has already long forgotten it? Maybe it's not such a bad thing after all. We're just trying to win the game of life. And the reason to win is so that you can be free of it.
We all want better for ourselves, whether it's a bigger house, nicer car, higher salary, thriving business, or more recognition. We all want things we don't have, and most of us spend the majority of our lives chasing these things. Success looks different to different people, but there's no arguing that we all have some definition of it, and that we often feel far from that definition. Thankfully, we aren't limited by our current circumstances, and with the right tools, we can get to where we want to be. Here is everything you need to start doing today to get ahead. Start by sleeping on a regular schedule. Sleeping on a regular schedule is a game changer for improving cognitive function and mood. In fact, having a consistent sleep schedule is often more important than sleeping for a specific number of hours. If you wake up at 6 a.m. for work but like to sleep in until 10 a.m. on the weekends, you might want to rethink your sleeping patterns so you sleep and wake up at the same time every day. Doing this helps your body develop a consistent rhythm and will allow you to build a schedule that works for you and the specific activities that you engage in. When you wake up, the first thing you should do is make your bed. Making your bed right after you get up might seem insignificant, but the reality is that accomplishing this small task at the start of your day sets the tone for the rest of it. You'll get a feeling of accomplishment that gives you the dopamine boost you need to tackle the more complex tasks you take on as your day progresses. It also gives you a sense of calm. Even if you can't control every aspect of your life, you're in control of where you lay your head to rest. And sorting out your sleeping area also means you'll be less likely to jump back into bed, which, as I'm sure you all know, can quickly lead to a very unproductive morning and entire day. I said sorting your sleeping area because even if you don't sleep on a bed or are currently unhoused, you can still get the benefits of making your bed by simply arranging your sleeping area. Whether it's rolling up mats or folding sheets, putting these things away gives you the same advantage as making your bed. You want to read books, magazines, newspapers? Just read. Several studies show that regular reading increases the communication between parts of your brain that control language and processing. It can also help improve concentration and prevent cognitive decline in old age. When trying to get ahead, most of us sacrifice our health at the altar of productivity. But the truth is that doing this is terrible in the long term, because if you're not in good health, you won't be able to produce your best. But just like exercising, meditating, and eating healthy, these are all tips you've heard before. So let's get a little more specific. How do you get ahead at work? Well, first it's essential to identify your goals. If you approach every workday with a big question mark, you'll likely lose focus and sense of direction quickly. But once you identify a goal like a raise, a promotion, or a particular benchmark, you can start each day with ideas on how to get closer to your goal, even if it takes you a while to get there. That's why it's good to be specific.
Think of yourself like a specialist rather than a generalist. With unlimited YouTube videos and college courses, many of us take advantage of dabbling in different skills and hobbies. The problem is that doing too many things can spread our attention so thin that it's difficult to hone in on that one skill that will move us forward. By becoming a specialist instead, especially in your work, you're more likely to build an impressive skill set that makes you stand out in the current difficult labor market. Of course, having hobbies and interests is essential for an excellent work-life balance, but in your career, just being okay at a lot of things doesn't get you nearly as far as being great at one or two things. Getting ahead is easier if you love what you do, or at least like it. Loving your work can sometimes be misunderstood as loving every aspect of your job, which is quite frankly impossible. Work is called work for a reason. It's not helpful to set the unrealistic expectation that you'll love every second of it. But suppose you are interested enough and perhaps even fulfilled at times by the work you do. In that case, you're more likely to push yourself further, enjoy building your skill sets, and face challenges with optimism rather than negativity. Once you get extremely proficient at your job, you'll soon discover that your skills can only get you so far. To get further ahead, you need to start promoting yourself. Now, self-promotion can sometimes get a bad rep, but if you've put in the time and effort to become a better employee, boss, or creative thinker, you deserve to brag about it. Also, making others aware of your accomplishments can do wonders to lift you off your plateau and keep moving forward. And when you do, having the right people around you is crucial. Stanford Graduate School of Business professor Bob Sutton says that your manager can have a more significant effect on your happiness and success than the company you work at. So whenever you have the opportunity, always choose to work with people who are quick to offer help when necessary. One thing to remember though is that if your managers or coworkers are there to help you, you have to be there to help them too. Being liked by people you work with and liking them back isn't so bad. You don't need the tough exterior that reigned superior in the workplace for so long. Putting up walls will cut you off from opportunities and, more importantly, relationships. Ask anyone anywhere in any field, and they'll all tell you that relationships are the key ingredient to a successful career. And how do you build relationships? Network. It's an annoying word, I know. Like me, you probably cringe at the idea of artificially making acquaintances for the sole purpose of advancing your career, but networking doesn't have to be like that. Think about all the people you've collaborated with. You might not have become friends with them, but you did get to know their innovative, motivated, and creative sides. If they needed a recommendation, wouldn't you happily give them one? Exactly. Networking in a meaningful way doesn't have to feel forced. It's building genuine connections with people who understand your work and are likely to help you in the future. As your network expands, you might start to compare yourself to others, but you shouldn't do that, because comparison is the thief of joy. Sometimes the best thing you can do to get ahead is to take what you want out of the equation. It may seem counterintuitive, but recognizing how your work contributes to other people's lives can make you more productive than just thinking about how it benefits you. Adam Grant is a renowned organizational psychologist who studies human behavior and helps people find motivation and meaning in their lives, especially in the workplace. In one of his earliest jobs selling ads for a travel guide series, he brought in a student who had been awarded a scholarship from his travel guide company to meet his colleagues, and after meeting the student, the entire company staff spent 142% more time on the phone and brought in 171% more revenue using the same sales scripts as before. Even though the content of their sales pitch didn't change, they were motivated, consciously and subconsciously, to do better by simply seeing someone who had been positively impacted by their work. So instead of worrying about what other people can do for you to help you get ahead, flip the switch and start thinking about what you can do for others. You'll be pleasantly surprised at how much more productive you are when you know your work is improving other people's lives. Now, the truth is, these things we've discussed aren't gas pedals you can step on to automatically speed you to the front of the rat race, because in reality, getting ahead is about more than a set of quick fixes. In fact, ahead isn't even a destination, it's a mindset. And it's essential to recognize that what might feel good in the short term might limit you in the long term. Eating an entire bowl of ice cream might seem like a fantastic idea today, and it might be, but keep doing that every day for the next few years and your health will suffer as a result. The same goes for how you can work to get ahead in life. Finding shortcuts or avoiding conflict can feel good, but when you decide to take the easy route, you're cheating yourself out of potential learning opportunities. Of course, it's equally important to be smart. Dragging things out just to feel like you're doing something can be a nasty trap, mainly because maintaining your stamina is another critical component to getting ahead. It's easy to quit, most people do it.
To become one of the people who don't, you'll need to push yourself, but not so hard that you burn out. You have to seek out challenges, nothing impossible, just practical ones that give you a healthy dose of dopamine once you accomplish them. You'll find small bits of motivation to hang on to when things get tough. You'll dig in and hang on even when things get rough. Failure is inevitable in all areas of life. No relationship is perfect, no job is perfect, no family is perfect. But instead of thinking of failure as a setback, think of it as an opportunity. It's information about your current mental and physical limitations and data about how you can improve. It's a reminder of how good it feels to try even when things don't work out. Failure teaches you that you aren't in this alone, and that asking for help isn't something to be ashamed of. Asking for help is actually one of life's remarkable skills, and so is saying, "I'm sorry." Accepting responsibility when you've done something wrong and not dishing out a meaningless apology allows others to see your humility. Once you accept that you make mistakes, sometimes even ones that hurt others, you're freed from the assumption that you always know what to do. Confusion is a part of life, and if you want to get ahead, you better learn how to navigate it. The only way to do that is by being able to adjust. We're all born into certain circumstances, hold particular beliefs, and expect different things out of life. But change is necessary even when it doesn't feel all that great. But here science has our back. You've probably heard the distinction between right and left-brained people. The theory is that if you're right-brain dominant, you're more intuitive, a creative thinker, qualitative about the way you perceive things, and you tend to look at the world with a big-picture lens. On the other hand, if you're a left-brain dominant, you're said to be more analytical. You pay attention to details, are ruled by logic, and you view the world more specifically and objectively. But a 2013 study by the University of Utah looked at the brains of over 1,000 young people between the ages of 7 and 29, and found no evidence of what we've been told about left and right-brained people. The study found that the activity in the left and right halves of a subject's brain was similar regardless of their personality. This is freeing because it means that there isn't some inherent brain chemistry that determines how you think and act. Depending on the situation, you can choose to be more analytical or more intuitive. You can adapt. So what is getting ahead? Is it earning more money, or is it about being able to look back and be proud of not just what you've done, but who you are? I'd argue for the latter, because just as much as you want to get ahead, it's easy to get ahead of yourself. To a place where you become so obsessed with your future, a place where your specific goals and feelings become so crucial to you that you lose sight of your journey. When people say it's lonely at the top, I often reply that they neglected everyone on their climb who loved them because they were so focused on the summit. Think about getting ahead more as a process rather than a race that you need to finish. Even as you're striving for excellence, always remember to stay in the present, looking around to take in the beauty of the experiences you're given on this journey of life. Getting ahead shouldn't have us running so fast that we pass on in an attempt to pass others. After all, life isn't a race to the finish, but an experience to be relished.
For the past month or so,